Have you ever noticed how we humans have this remarkable capacity for self-deception? We move through life convinced that we're acting from our highest wisdom, making rational choices, responding to situations authentically. We pride ourselves on our self-awareness, our emotional intelligence, our spiritual growth. And yet, even as we congratulate ourselves on our evolution, there's this hidden force operating beneath the surface of our consciousness, pulling the strings, making decisions, and driving our behaviors in ways we rarely recognize. I'm talking about the ego, not simply as a psychological concept, but as that intricate system of identification, defense, and self-preservation that masquerades as your true self. But what if I told you that this ego, this collection of beliefs, identifications, and reactive patterns that you've mistaken for your essence, is actually running your life far more than you realize? What if, despite all your personal development work, your meditation practice, your therapy, your carefully curated self-image as an evolved being, you're still largely operating from this unconscious programming that keeps you trapped in cycles of suffering, separation, and subtle self-sabotage? If you enjoy this type of deep reflection, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like this video. And most importantly, leave a comment below telling us if this has ever happened to you, or if you know someone who passed through this. You see, the ego isn't what most people think it is. It's not just arrogance or excessive pride or self-importance, though it can certainly manifest that way. At its core, the ego is a survival mechanism, a complex identity structure that developed to help you navigate the world, to create a sense of stability and continuity, to protect you from perceived threats. And in that capacity, it served an important purpose in your early development. But like many systems that outlive their usefulness, the ego doesn't willingly relinquish control. It doesn't announce its presence or admit its limitations. Instead, it operates covertly, disguising itself as wisdom, as intuition, as your authentic voice. This is what makes the ego so difficult to detect. It speaks in the first person. It doesn't say the ego is afraid or the ego wants recognition. It says, I am afraid or I deserve recognition. It doesn't present its perspective as one of many possible interpretations. It presents it as objective reality. This is just how things are. Anyone would feel this way. I'm only being realistic. And in this seamless ventriloquism, this perfect mimicry of your true voice, the ego maintains its grip on your perception and behavior. The first sign that your ego is secretly controlling your life is that you find yourself constantly comparing your journey to others. Now, comparison itself is a natural cognitive function. We make sense of the world by noticing differences and similarities. But ego-driven comparison has a particular quality. It's always positioning you in a hierarchy, always concerned with whether you're ahead or behind, better or worse, winning or losing. And this comparative mindset creates a peculiar form of suffering, because no matter where you land in the comparison, you lose. If you determine that you're better than others, more spiritual, more evolved, more conscious, then you've separated yourself from them. You've created division where there is none, erected barriers to genuine connection, and trapped yourself in the isolation of superiority. If you determine that you're worse than others, less accomplished, less evolved, less worthy, then you've diminished yourself unnecessarily, overlooked your inherent value, and created suffering through a false sense of inadequacy. Either way, you're not seeing clearly. You're seeing through the distorting lens of ego. I remember speaking with a woman, let's call her Sarah, who had spent decades on a spiritual path. She'd studied with renowned teachers, participated in countless retreats, developed a rigorous meditation practice. She considered herself quite advanced, and yet she was plagued by a subtle but persistent unhappiness. When we explored this together, she realized that she was constantly measuring her spiritual progress against others. Either she was secretly congratulating herself, for being ahead of less evolved seekers, or she was berating herself for not being as advanced as her teachers and role models. Either way, her spiritual practice had become a vehicle for ego enhancement rather than ego transcendence. The breakthrough came when she recognized that true spiritual growth isn't linear, isn't competitive, isn't something that can be measured on a single scale. It's unique to each person, unfolding in its own timing, in its own way. When she stopped comparing her journey to others and simply focused on her own authentic unfolding, she found a peace that had eluded her despite years of practice. The second sign that your ego is secretly controlling your life is that you're caught in cycles of reactivity that feel beyond your control. The ego thrives on reactivity, the immediate, unthinking responses to triggers that bypass your higher awareness. These reactions can take many forms: anger when criticized, defensiveness when questioned, withdrawal when hurt, control when anxious. But they all share a common quality. They feel automatic, as if they're happening to you rather than being chosen by you. When you're in the grip of these reactive patterns, there's a telltale constriction, a narrowing of perspective, a sense of compulsion. You know you're overreacting, but you can't seem to stop. You're aware that your response isn't helping the situation, but you feel powerless to choose differently. You might even have the surreal experience of watching yourself behave in ways that don't align with your values or intentions, as if some other force has temporarily hijacked your system. That force is the ego, and it's operating from old programming, from unhealed wounds, from primitive survival mechanisms. It's not concerned with your happiness or growth or relationships. It's concerned with defending the identity structure it's built, with being right, with avoiding anything that threatens its sense of self. And it will sacrifice your well-being, your relationships, even your deepest values to maintain its position. I once worked with a man who considered himself a deeply spiritual person, committed to kindness and compassion. Yet in his intimate relationship, he would fly into rage at the slightest criticism from his partner. Afterward, he'd be filled with remorse, unable to reconcile his reactive behavior with his spiritual values. The key insight came when he realized that his spiritual identity itself had become an ego structure, a carefully constructed self-image that criticism threatened to dismantle. His rage wasn't protecting him, it was protecting the ego's investment in seeing himself as spiritual. Once he recognized this, he could approach his reactivity with greater awareness and compassion, seeing it not as a moral failure, but as a signpost pointing to where healing was needed. The third sign that your ego is secretly controlling your life is that you're constantly seeking validation and recognition for your accomplishments, qualities, or experiences. The ego has an insatiable hunger for external confirmation of its worth. It needs others to acknowledge its specialness, its rightness, its value. This need can be obvious, as in the person who brags about their achievements or fishing for compliments. But it can also be quite subtle and disguised, as in the spiritual seeker who needs others to validate their enlightenment experiences, or the helper who needs to be needed, or the humble person who needs recognition for their humility. This constant seeking of validation creates a dependency on others' responses that keeps you tethered to their opinions, their approval, their recognition. It puts your sense of worth in hands outside yourself, leaving you vulnerable to the changing winds of external feedback. And it creates a kind of inner emptiness, a hole that no amount of validation seems to fill permanently, because external validation can never touch the place inside that truly needs healing, the place where you learned, somehow, that your inherent worth wasn't enough. I remember a conversation with a talented artist who was deeply frustrated by his lack of recognition. He'd created beautiful work, but it hadn't received the attention he felt it deserved. As we talked, it became clear that he wasn't creating primarily from love of the craft or the joy of expression, but from a desperate need to be seen, to be validated, to receive the recognition that his ego believed would finally make him feel worthy. This need was so dominant that it had actually started to interfere with his creative process. He was making choices based not on artistic integrity, but on what he thought would gain approval. The turning point came when he began to disentangle his creative expression from his need for validation. He reconnected with the intrinsic joy of creation, the process itself, rather than the outcome or reception. And paradoxically, as he released the desperate need for recognition, his work became more authentic, more powerful, and ultimately received more genuine appreciation. Not because he was seeking it, but because he was no longer creating from the ego's emptiness, but from the soul's fullness. The fourth sign that your ego is secretly controlling your life is that you're living in constant resistance to what is. The ego cannot accept reality as it unfolds. It's perpetually at war with the present moment, always believing that things should be different than they are, that you should be different, that others should be different, that circumstances should be different. This resistance shows up as complaint, as criticism, as blame, as resentment, as anxiety about the future, as regret about the past, all the myriad ways we refuse to meet life as it's actually presenting itself. This resistance creates tremendous suffering because it puts you at odds with reality itself. It's like swimming upstream against a current that never stops flowing. It exhausts your energy and attention, keeping you trapped in futile struggle rather than creative engagement. And perhaps most significantly, it keeps you from experiencing the depth and richness of life as it's actually unfolding, always filtering your experience through the ego's judgments of how things should be. I once knew a man who seemed to carry a cloud of discontent with him wherever he went. No matter the circumstance, no matter the company, he found something to criticize, something lacking, something not quite right. A beautiful sunset wasn't quite as vibrant as one he'd seen before. A thoughtful gift wasn't exactly what he would have chosen. A sincere compliment was dismissed because it came from someone whose opinion he didn't value. He would have described himself as having high standards, but what he actually had was an ego that refused to allow him to enjoy life as it presented itself. The shift began when he started to notice the toll this constant resistance was taking, not just on his happiness, but on his relationships, his health, his ability to be present for the life that was right in front of him. He began practicing a simple but powerful question. When he noticed himself in resistance, what would it be like to accept this exactly as it is? Not in resignation or defeat, but in a genuine openness to reality as it was presenting itself. This practice gradually softened the ego's rigid demands, allowing him to meet life with more flexibility, more receptivity, more genuine appreciation. So what do you do if you recognize these signs in yourself? How do you begin to loosen the ego's secret grip on your life? The first step is simply to become aware of the ego's operations without judgment. The ego loves to turn everything into a self-improvement project, including spiritual growth. If you approach this exploration as another way to fix yourself, you're still operating from the ego's framework. Instead, bring a quality of curious, compassionate observation to these patterns. Notice when comparison arises, when reactivity takes over, when you're seeking validation, when you're in resistance to what is. Not to judge yourself for these tendencies, but to shine the light of awareness on what has been operating in the shadows. The second step is to recognize that you are not your ego. This seems obvious, but it's a profound realization when experienced directly. The very fact that you can observe these ego patterns means that you are not identical to them. There's a witnessing awareness, a deeper consciousness that can see the ego's operations without being caught in them. This awareness is not another ego structure. It's the background against which all ego structures arise and dissolve. It's what some traditions call your true nature, your essential self, the ground of being that you are prior to all identifications and constructions. From this awareness, you can begin to create space around the ego's reactions and demands. You don't need to fight the ego or try to get rid of it. That just creates another form of inner conflict. Instead, you simply stop identifying with it so completely. You learn to recognize its voice, its particular quality, its familiar patterns, without automatically assuming that voice is you. This creates a freedom of response that wasn't available when you were completely identified with the ego's perspective. The third step is to practice returning to the present moment whenever you notice the ego pulling you into its dramas of comparison, reactivity, validation seeking, or resistance. The ego cannot survive in the fullness of present moment awareness. It needs the past for its identity, the future for its projects of becoming, the mental realm of judgment and assessment and storytelling. When you bring your attention fully into the present, into the direct experience of your senses, into the aliveness of this moment, the ego temporarily loses its grip. This is why so many spiritual traditions emphasize present moment awareness as a core practice. It's not just a nice state to experience occasionally, it's a direct antidote to the ego's dominance. Each time you fully enter the present moment, you're creating a new neural pathway, a new habit of consciousness that gradually becomes more accessible, more natural, more your default way of being. You're rewiring your system to operate from presence rather than ego. The fourth step is to cultivate genuine humility. Not the false humility of the spiritual ego that secretly believes it's special for being so humble, but the authentic humility that comes from recognizing your place in the larger web of life. True humility isn't thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less, as C.S. Lewis famously said. It's releasing the ego's constant self-referencing, its need to make everything about me and my journey, my growth, my understanding. This humility opens you to a different way of being in the world, one where you're neither the center of the universe nor an insignificant speck, but a unique expression of the whole, connected to all other expressions through a common ground of being. From this perspective, the ego's constant positioning and defending and validating seeking begins to seem unnecessary, even slightly comical. Not because you've transcended your humanity, but because you've relaxed into it more fully, accepting both your remarkable uniqueness and your complete ordinariness as aspects of the same reality. So these are the 4 signs that your ego is secretly controlling your life. You're caught in constant comparison, you're trapped in cycles of reactivity, you're seeking validation and recognition, and you're living in resistance to what is. And these are the antidotes: aware observation without judgment, recognition of your identity beyond ego, present moment awareness, and genuine humility. But I want to emphasize that this isn't about achieving some perfect state of egolessness. It's not another project for the ego to undertake, not another way to position yourself as spiritually superior, not another identity to construct. The ego doesn't disappear entirely, it just assumes its proper place as a functional aspect of your humanity rather than the center of your identity. It becomes a tool rather than the wielder of the tool, an aspect of your experience rather than the definer of it. And in this rebalancing, something remarkable happens. The energy that was trapped in ego maintenance, in defending, positioning, comparing, seeking, resisting, becomes available for creative expression, for genuine connection, for appreciation of the remarkable gift of being alive in this moment, just as it is. This release from the ego's dominance isn't a one-time achievement. It's an ongoing practice, a continuous unwinding of old patterns, a persistent returning to the truth of what you are beyond all identifications. Some days, you'll find yourself completely caught in ego dynamics, reacting from old conditioning, seeking validation, resisting reality. That's part of the journey too. The difference is that now you can recognize what's happening. You can see the ego's operations with compassion rather than judgment, with clarity rather than confusion. And in that seeing, you're already beginning to disentangle yourself from its grip. The irony is that what the ego has been seeking all along, security, fulfillment, recognition, peace, can only be found when its dominance recedes. The very thing it's been chasing through its strategies of control and defense and position is revealed to be already here, in the simple miracle of existence, in the wonder of awareness itself, in the profound gift of being alive in this moment just as you are. Not perfect, not complete, not enlightened, just authentically, vulnerably, remarkably human. And in that authentic humanity, something far greater than the ego can express itself through you. The unique gift that only you can bring, the singular melody that only your life can play in the great symphony of existence.